West Bengal Poultry Federation for the invitation, and for the NOVACON organizing committee also for the invitation. I also need to give a special thanks for somebody that is here in the audience, and I can proudly say it's a personal friend, Dr. Sudipal Haldar, also for allowing me to be here today. The topic for my presentation today, as agreed, is to talk about the Brazilian poultry and a little bit about the secrets of the success that we have in the Brazilian poultry. I think here is something that is important for us to highlight, that there is no such thing as a secret. And I think this is one of the messages that we're going to try to pass through the presentation. It's nothing special or different than Brazilian industry is doing. It's basically trying to work together on the different areas and the different chains that are part of that industry, trying to bring to the best benefit for and the best production. And I think this is something that I would like also to highlight, that from the previous presentation from Mr. Kumar, I think there is a lot of correlations on what he was presenting, on the work that is being done here in West Bengal, and what Brazil has done, and it will continue to do as part of the development of this industry. So here am I talking about the Brazilian poultry, but why am I here? So my background is, as presented before, I have worked in the industry for several years. I have some experience also working both in the production, but also in the supplement side, and work also with some connections in other industries in South America, and more recently in outside of South America. And I think that also brings a good perspective, not only on how Brazilians see their own industry, but how also this other world, the outside of Brazil and the global see that same industry. So I think that's also an important perspective for us to consider. So if you look a little bit on a comparison, why are we talking here in India about the Brazilian poultry production? And if you look into some key characteristics of both societies, what we see is that we do have some similarities and we do have some differences. So if you look into the political environment, both are, I would say, strong democracies that has been democracies and has been reinforcing that important part of the society development on the last 20, 30, 40 years. So that's also an important part, because we need to remember that any production is part of a bigger society, and that becomes an important part of the process. If you look economically, I also think there are some similarities at the moment. Economies that are growing but still have pressure on inflation, what end up affecting the power of the society has to buy goods and services. More on the social side, we see here already some differences. Clearly, Brazil has a strong meat consumption, more related than also to our topic here, where India have much lower meat consumption, also because of cultural differences between both societies. That said, though, what we see also, and you know probably this better than me even, is a strong growth in meat consumption in India in recent years, and trends to continue to grow. Now, population is also a bigger impact here, and we need to remember that if India increase meat consumption by 1 or 2 kilos per person per day, that probably represents more the whole meat consumption in other countries. So the size of the population also play an important topic here. On the technological side, what we see in Brazil is high technology use in the poultry industry, with a more or less stable internal market and big export focus. Export is a key part and has been a key part of the development of the Brazilian industry, and we are going to try to explain a little bit why we see that. And in India we see, as we said before, an increased demand for meat, what is also linked to higher urbanization. We still have, looking at the numbers that I've been able to search. I don't know if that is specifically correct. Around 40% of the population in urban areas in India, where in Brazil, the number is around 80 to 90%. And more on the specific production side, in India we still, and we have this discussion before, not necessarily minimum price, but more control or a reference of price to drive to the industry. Where in Brazil, what we have seen, and we're going to show here, is that the production is transiting from more the southern part of Brazil to the central, west and northeast of Brazil, where you still have expansion on land. That's where also the grains have moved, but you start to have environmental questions about that expansion. Some similarities and some differences. So when we look into the Brazilian poultry production, and I think one part here that is important to highlight is that when we talk about poultry production in Brazil, we don't isolate it as the production itself. We need to look into the whole chain. From the production of the cereals that are going to be used in the feed, also the technology for the vaccines and the genetic development that are important for the animals, to the production itself, the processing, the distribution, and the end consumers. When we talk about integration in Brazil, integration is more than having one company that owns the feed production and the production of the animals. Is a company that is able to control and integrate from the production of feed and the ingredients that are used in the whole process up to owning the brand of the ready meal that is offered in the supermarket for the consumer. That ready meal that has meat as part of it, but when you eat a lasagna, you have the chicken meat, but you also have the wheat flour and all the other process. So when you think about integration in Brazil, we need to expand our view that is bigger than just the poultry production. And that is also, I see, part of the key secrets, let's say, of the Brazilian production. So when you look into the history, how has Brazil evolved in meat production, we need to remember here also that that's probably started in 1920. Until 1920, for example, Brazil didn't have soy production locally. The expansion of soy production, the expansion of the cereal production in Brazil started around 1920, 1930. Between 1960 and 1970, there has been a strong support from the government that saw agriculture as a key strategy development for the country and tried to organize all those changes to be able to develop that industry. That started, for example, in one reference, is the implementation of the Embrapa, the internal research organization from the Brazilian government that helped to develop the industry, bring genetic lines, develop genetic lines for poultry and cereals, and up to date do a little bit of that work, similar to what we have been hearing before in the last presentation. And we also had in Brazil at that time the boost and the development of other areas like state service to support the development and the growth of the local producers. The small farmers were supported by the government to be able to produce better. Launch of agricultural universities with veterinary schools, agricultural schools in different parts of Brazil, especially in rural areas, to be able to take this knowledge outside of the big cities, and the stimulus for that integration system. In 1990 to the years 2000, we had what is called the Plano Real, that reduced inflation in Brazil from around 80% per month to 4% per year. And that gave a boost in capital for the population to buy more goods, and that increased a lot meat consumption, especially poultry consumption in Brazil. That growth in that period from around 10 kilos per person per year to 30 to 35 kilos in a period of 10 to 20 years. So that growth was caused by people having more money to spend on food, and also that urbanization, because people move away from rural areas where they were producing their own chickens and moved to the city where they had to buy the chickens. Now, from a statistics perspective, the chicken just exists when you buy it. When you produce your own, nobody knows you have produced it. So that has also been part of this growth in the Brazilian meat production, because allow that consumption becomes part of a market. And what we see now in the last 15, 20 years is a continued growth of this internal market, not the same speed. So we move from 35 to around 45 kilos, and we start to have a substitution from bovine, more expensive meat, to chicken, also because of price, and open and expansion to external markets. If we see around the history, and that's what we have, if you look at chicken meat, you have here pork. I know pork here in it is not so important, but I will explain why we have pork here. So we have an export that was around 1 million tons to 15 million tons in the last 40 years in chicken meat. So more than 30 times growth. Brazil is today the second largest chicken and meat producer and the world leader in exports. You can see the same impact in pig production, a big increase from 1970 up to in the last 50 years, already the fourth large pork producer and exporter in the world, fifth large egg producer in the world, not so much important on export. And also important to say is that also allows to bring more value to the chain, because exporting meat means to have more money inside the business than exporting corn or soy, and more employment inside the country, what is something that the industry works a lot with the government, because keeping that employment in the country and bringing that money into the country as part of the export is part of the strategy in the Brazilian development piece. So a little bit more on the actual position on production for chicken and pork. Again, you can see around 35% of the whole Brazilian production is focused on export or on exports, and around 25% in pigs. A little bit on other industries, just to see how important the focus on external market is to Brazil. If you look into Turkey, around 50% of Brazil produce is for the exported market. Ducks, not really important for internal consumption, not a really big market, but still you have around 80% of the whole duck production. So Brazilian only produce duck because somebody outside of Brazil is buying it. That's how integrated and how important that market is, and you can only achieve that if you're able to have access to that market and have that discussion. Eggs, growth and increase in production, arriving now to around 240 eggs per day, and genetic material, so the eggs and the day-old chicks and the grandparents being also exported to other markets and creating another chain for this development. If you look into Brazil production and a little bit into geography, we still have a quite centralized production here in the south. That's where around 90% of the export production comes from, and it's usually exported through ports here in São Paulo, Paraná, Santa Catarina, and Rio Grande do Sul states. Why is that important? Because this is the traditional area where poultry production has traditionally happened in Brazil. What we start to see now is a move into a different direction. That's also traditionally where grains start to be produced. So the first soy production in Brazil happened here in the Rio Grande do Sul states. And what we see nowadays is that grain production moving to the central west and the northeast of Brazil. Naturally, wherever grain goes, poultry follows. Because the grain is the key cost of production. Where grains goes and is being more produced, chicken will follow, and they are going to produce chickens in those same areas. So what we still have today in Brazil is that the production is moving north, because grain already moved north, but the export process is still happening through south. So all that chicken that is produced here, they go to internal market or they need to drive all the way down to be exported. Now, part of the new development, this is something that the government is trying to work with, is try to do exports through ports that we have in north, or do the transfer through the Pacific, passing the Andes mountains and exporting through Peru or Colombia, and that becomes a much easier route. Here are easier routes to Europe, here an easier route to China and the Eastern Hemisphere. But this is also part of, and I think this is part of where you're going to come back, part of the development where you need to have this strong association between the industry and the government. So I think when we talk about secrets of success, and again, it's not a success itself, what we have in Brazil is a strong work between the government and what is the role and the government play in that industry, the integration and how important that whole integration system is for the Brazilian industry and associations. And that's what I'm going to try to cover here with some examples. So the first demo with the government, and again, I think there is a change on how the government saw themselves as part of the development process during that early stage, and that's where I think there is some association to what we hear here today before with all the activity that West Bengal government is doing. Initially, you had quite of an enable route where the government were there to support and boost and actively try to increase that production. So technical support, the basic knowledge and support, developing the capability in the society to be able to have that production. That probably changed between 1990s and the year 2000, 2010, when you have the integration system, the integration absorbed that responsibility. Today, you don't need somebody from the government to teach how to raise chickens, because the integration system do that job. What is the role that the government has today is to develop an implementation of policies, trying to negotiate and having export agreements with other countries, where again, associations is a key part of it, and development of the required structure to allow the private companies to boost their own production. So when we are talking, we are going to show here, when we are talking that we need, one of the options is to have the ports in the north of Brazil or to have the roads to the Pacific. Somebody needs to build those roads. Somebody has to have an agreement with other countries to be able to have the cross and access to those ports to be able to export. And that just happened through government. There's not private company that will be able and have the power to have that level of negotiation. So Embrapa, just as one example, as we said before, on how that changed. Embrapa has been a key boost for the production in Brazil when it was formed in around 1970s on genetic development, bring the new genetics, bringing artificial insemination, for example, in bovine, and developing specific genetic soy and wheat and corn for the Brazilian environment. That was all done by Embrapa. We still have Embrapa with around 50 different research areas in different parts of Brazil, each one of them to try to support the key strategy production in that area. So for example, the swine and poultry research site is here, but soy is here, and tropical fruits are in the Amazon, because that's where you can see the capability for that business development. Nowadays, Embrapa moved more to more of a support, and they do a lot of work on defining cost of production in different parts of Brazil to enable better negotiation by the government and the private companies with external potential customers, and also to monitor that cost of production and how much that would impact the population ability to buy those goods. And as I said before, I think the government still have a strong capability on developing all of that structures to be able for then the private companies to perform. So when you're talking about expanding these to different ports, somebody needs to build those roads, somebody needs to create agreements with neighbor countries, somebody needs to facilitate the construction of and the development of these new ports and the cold chain in all of these different areas. So the integration system, I think one thing that is important here, again, to highlight that is not only related to the production itself, it is related to ability to pick up those grains and transform into goods that are going to be eaten by the population all across the world. It is beyond producing chicken, it is about producing the chicken nuggets or the lasagna or the pasta that we buy in the supermarket. The chicken becomes just part of that whole integration process. Why is this important? Because this brings a huge advantage to those Brazilian companies. Because the grain is basically the same, the process is within some characteristics similar, the cold chain is the same, the customers or the distributor route is the same, and the customer is similar. So what that happened is that the integration of Brazilian industry and the brand development that you have works across species. I just pick up here the 6 big chicken producers in Brazil, and you can see here where they have activity. So you have the 6 biggest broiler producers, JBS, BRF, Aurora, Copacol, Cival, and LAR. From those 6 producers, all of them also are key big producer in the swine industry. Because the soy is the same, the corn is the same, the lorry that transport the frozen meat is the same, the producing of the lasagna is the same, the distributing is the same, the supermarket is the same. So you integrate all of those systems beyond just one meat, but overseeing all of these different structures. Of course, pig and poultry is a most strong correlation, but you already have that through aqua, where you see those 4 cooperatives are already key players into the aqua industry, especially tilapia. JBS and BRF are the 2 biggest meat producers in Brazil. And one news that happened 2 or 3 weeks ago, JBS bought 50% of Mantiqueira, who is the big egg producer in Brazil. So that process of integration, of the whole integration of that food business, looking it beyond chicken, is part of what I see the success of the Brazilian. But to do that, you need to have strong companies and business that can do that kind of process. Associations is the third part of what we're going to talk about, because this is not only about that company itself, is how that company build itself with other companies to support what is the best for the industry. This is from the last report from the Brazilian Association of Poultry and Swine Producers. And I just want to highlight here that you have producers and suppliers as part of that association. And you probably can see here brands that you use as poultry producers that are part of this association that try to increase the Brazilian footprint and the poultry and swine production and export in Brazil all across the world. That is the ability to see that beyond what is better for my company. It's about seeing what is better for this industry, because if this industry grows, everybody will grow together. So this association represents 85% of the pork production in Brazil, 9% of the poultry production, and 95% of all exports in Brazil. Some examples of what this kind of association can do: work with insight with government, trying to have new agreements. This is from last year, achievement in the industry. So new agreements and sales into all of these countries for poultry, pork, eggs, and genetic material. Participation in expositions, part of negotiations for cross-country commercial agreements. All of these, it's not the government trying to do it itself, the government has the insight from the industry and the support of the industry to do it. What also means that the government will see this area of the business as a key priority on those negotiations. And when you look into what the Brazilian government tried to negotiate when they are doing dual agreements with other countries, agricultural and meat production is always something key that they will try to bring into that discussion to open those new markets for the Brazilian industry. Another thing that I think it's important, and I think it was highlighted here also in the previous presentation a little bit, there is also an internal work that needs to be done. Regionalization and sanitary regionalization has been a key thing that Brazil did in the last 20 years. It's been a lot of work, but basically what it means is to have defined sanitary status per region, what in Brazil works on the 27 different states. What this means is that if you have any outbreak of any disease in one state in Brazil, you can quickly isolate that area. You don't allow the meat to leave that area. You kill all the animals or you process the animals. And that isolates, so that export ability that Brazil has is not lost, only that small area that is affected. There is a lot of work that goes behind this about geolocation of all the poultry farms, links with the current integrator for that poultry farm, and monthly or quarterly meetings between all the industry producers on that area and the government to review that and do updates and checks all the time. So when and if an outbreak happens, the industry is ready to react. Not because that area where we had the outbreak will have a problem, but doesn't allow that to expand into other areas. And biosecurity is probably one of the key differentiations when you look into the Brazilian industry, and that's because the industry takes it highly, highly serious. I've been out of the industry for 10 years. I visit Brazil and I visit customers routinely. I don't think I have been able to see a Brazilian farm in the last 10 years. And I think this is good, because I don't need to be there. I am at risk if I'm visiting a farm. I have nothing to do there. We need to have strong biosecurity to be able to play this long game in the industry. One final example on how this association can work. This has also happened 3 or 4 months ago. So a little bit of background information. In France, there was a new election, and there was a lot of discussion about the deal between Mercosur, the government body between Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, with the European Union. And the CEO of Carrefour, what is the biggest supermarket in France, said for their own internal population in France that Carrefour would boycott the Mercosur meat in France and wouldn't buy any meat from the Mercosur in France, trying to support the French producers. The challenge is that what he said is that he was going to do that because the standards of the meat in the Mercosur were not the same as the standard of quality of meat in France. What was the reaction? First, the government, 2 days later, react against the remarks from the CEO from Carrefour, saying that the meat production in the Mercosur, especially in Brazil, was the same quality because it was following the same standards as the meat production in France. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to export to France. And then the day later, the whole Brazilian meat supplier said that if our meat is not good quality for you to sell in France, we are not selling our meat to you in Brazil. And from one day to another, Carrefour had no meat to sell in Brazil. This is, for me, a strong way how we work within an association. Because no company were in the back of the association and said, Carrefour, I can sell to you if you give me 20% extra price. That was a block in that because of some strong argument against the quality of the meat of the whole country. Of course, the day later, Carrefour apologized. And then things go back to normal. But that's how important it is to have that strong association and the strong support that goes beyond your own production. It is about the production and the market that you are active on. I'm just finishing, I know the time is up. So when we talk about secrets of success, and I'm not going to go too philosophical here. When we speak in Portuguese, we have a differentiation between the verb to be. And I was looking in Hindi, I don't think you also have this differentiation. What is, you have one verb that we use for more of a permanent change, and one verb that you use for more of a variable change of the verb to be. So for example, I can say that I'm happy. I'm happy to be here in India. Those who knows me knows how happy I am to be in India. Every time that I'm here, I'm really glad to be here. But I will be upset on Friday, because I'll be going back home to rainy and cold England. So the feeling of to be happy will change in time. I am Brazilian, and I will always be Brazilian. That will not change ever. So the verb in Portuguese is different for those two different associations, but it still is a verb to be. Why is this a little bit philosophical? Because when you look into the Brazilian secret, a lot of things when we hear from external sources is the permanent thing. Brazil is a success because it's big. Brazil is a success because it can produce a lot of grain. Brazil is a success because as it produces a lot of cheap grain, it can produce a lot of cheap chicken. That is the permanent thing. Brazil is big, and of course it will be able to have that, but would be the same for Argentina or Russia or China or other countries that are also big. Why they cannot do it is because of the transitory one. Is because there are things that we need to do to be able to achieve that, and to explore that benefit, and to reduce those risks, and to reduce and have an outcome of those challenges that those countries as India, as Brazil always have. How India can use the best thing that India has, how India can reduce the challenge that India has. That is the part where you're not just accepting that you have something good or accepting that you have something bad, you need to act on it. And I think that's where you have the efficiency, the business mindset, the government association, and the industry coordination. What doesn't come as granted? That is ourselves, organizing ourselves, how to play in that market. That's the success of Brazil. It's not the size, it's not the ability to produce soy, because there was no soy there 100 years ago. Somebody had to make it happen. So, of course, what can the industry in India learn from this experience? I think it's for the industry in India to try to understand. I think what Brazil shows is that it's possible. It's possible to be a key player in a market like that. You just need to understand and have a strategic focus on how to do that. It is about developing a long-term strategy. Brazil have moved from a farmer approach to an industry approach. India can follow the same route, or India can find a new route that is better fit for India. But I think the development of those associations that can support the whole industry as a whole and a strong association with the government, that's where the different benefits can come from. Thanks very much.